What could cause a civilization at the very zenith of its power, a culture of artists and mariners who dominated the Mediterranean, to vanish almost overnight from the pages of history? The answer lies buried under 100 feet of volcanic ash on a spectacular Greek island, a cataclysm so immense it reshaped the ancient world. This is the story of the Minoans of Crete, Europe's first great advanced civilization, and the apocalypse that befell them. Their legacy is one of breathtaking beauty and an abrupt, tragic end, a puzzle that has fascinated archaeologists for over a century. It began not with an invading army, but with a tremor in the earth and a fire in the sea. On the island of Crete, the Minoans built a society that seemed centuries ahead of its time. From around 2000 BCE, they constructed vast, sprawling palace complexes at Knossos, Phaistos, and Mallia, which served as administrative, religious, and commercial centers. These were not fortified castles, suggesting a culture confident in its security and perhaps relatively peaceful. Their artisans produced exquisite pottery, intricate gold jewelry, and vibrant frescoes depicting a world rich with ritual and natural beauty. The Minoans were the masters of the sea, their ships carrying goods and ideas across the Aegean and to the great civilizations of Egypt and the Levant. This maritime empire was built upon a network of islands, and one of the most crucial was Thera, known today as Santorini. Located about 120 kilometers north of Crete, Thera was a thriving volcanic island, home to a sophisticated settlement that would one day be known as Akrotiri. Excavations have revealed a city of extraordinary wealth, with multi-story buildings built of stone, advanced town planning, and a complex system of drains and pipes for running water and sewage. The streets were paved, and houses were decorated with magnificent frescoes, earning it the nickname the _0_. Unlike Pompeii, however, the inhabitants of Akrotiri seem to have escaped the disaster, as no human remains have been found within the ruins. The art of Akrotiri reveals a vibrant and cosmopolitan culture deeply connected to the wider Minoan world. Frescoes depict naval processions, exotic animals like monkeys and antelopes, and elaborate religious ceremonies, suggesting a people of great refinement and global awareness. One famous painting, the _1, depicts a lush, red lily-covered landscape, a testament to the island's beauty before the disaster. Another, the Boxing Princes, shows young men engaged in a sport, hinting at the daily life of its inhabitants. Archaeologists believe that Akrotiri was a vital outpost for trade, processing goods like oil and wine for export across the Minoan thalassocracy. It was a jewel in the Minoan crown, a symbol of their prosperity and reach. But this idyllic existence was precariously perched atop one of the most dangerous volcanoes on the planet. Around 1600 BCE, the earth beneath Thera began to stir, warning the population of the impending doom. Archaeological evidence shows that inhabitants had time to evacuate, taking their valuables with them before the final cataclysmic eruption. This period of seismic activity likely caused widespread panic and damage across the southern Aegean. Then, the volcano erupted in an event of almost unimaginable scale, far exceeding any human witness in recorded history. The blast column of ash and rock soared tens of kilometers into the stratosphere, visible for hundreds of miles in every direction. Modern geological studies estimate the eruption of Thera, also known as the Minoan eruption, had a volcanic explosivity index of 6 or 7, making it one of the largest in the last few thousand years. It ejected over 60 cubic kilometers of rock and ash, 4 times the amount of the more famous Krakatoa eruption in 1883. The initial phase of the eruption blanketed the surrounding islands, including Crete, in a thick layer of pumice and ash, collapsing roofs and contaminating water supplies. Following this, pyroclastic flows, fast-moving currents of hot gas, ash, and rock, swept across the island of Thera at hundreds of kilometers per hour. These superheated avalanches instantly buried the city of Akrotiri, preserving it perfectly under a shroud of volcanic tuff. The most dramatic phase of the catastrophe was the collapse of the volcano's magma chamber, which caused the center of the island to implode and sink into the sea. This event created the vast, steep-walled caldera that forms the stunning lagoon of modern Santorini, a legacy of the disaster. The collapse of the caldera displaced an immense volume of seawater, triggering a series of massive tsunamis that radiated outwards across the Aegean Sea. These waves were not ordinary ocean swells. They were towering walls of water, perhaps dozens of meters high, moving at terrifying speed. The northern and eastern coasts of Crete, the heart of the Minoan civilization, lay directly in the path of this watery onslaught. The tsunamis smashed into the Minoan fleet, harbors, and coastal towns with devastating force. The great palace at Amnisos, the main port for the capital of Knossos, was utterly destroyed and abandoned. Archaeological investigations have found tsunami deposits, including marine shells and sand, hundreds of meters inland on the Cretan coast, far beyond the reach of any normal wave. This destruction crippled Minoan maritime power, wrecking their ships and crippling the trade network that was the foundation of their wealth and influence. With their ports in ruins and their economy shattered, the once dominant Minoans were suddenly isolated and vulnerable. The psychological impact of seeing the sea, their source of life, turn into an instrument of total destruction must have been profound. The catastrophe was not confined to the local region. The eruption had global climatic consequences. The vast plume of sulfur dioxide and ash injected into the stratosphere circled the globe, creating a "3" that lasted for several years. This aerosol haze blocked sunlight, causing global temperatures to drop significantly, leading to crop failures, famine, and social unrest far from the Aegean. Evidence from ice cores drilled in Greenland shows a distinct spike in volcanic acid deposition precisely from this period. Scientists have identified tephra, or volcanic glass, in the ice layers that chemically matches the eruption of Thera, providing a definitive date for the event. Further confirmation of this global climate shock comes from the study of ancient tree rings, a science known as dendrochronology. Bristlecone pine trees from California and oak trees from Ireland show extremely narrow growth rings for the years following the eruption, indicating unusually cold and poor growing conditions. In China, historical records from the "4" mention a yellow, foggy twilight obscuring the sun for several years, a phenomenon consistent with a massive volcanic eruption. These disparate sources of evidence from around the world paint a picture of a global environmental crisis triggered by a single geological event. The Minoan apocalypse, therefore, was not just a regional disaster, but a shockwave that reverberated across the planet. The direct and indirect consequences of the eruption plunged Minoan society into a terminal decline from which it would never recover. The loss of their fleet and the destruction of their coastal infrastructure crippled their economy. The climatic effects likely led to widespread food shortages, social unrest, and a loss of faith in the ruling class, who were unable to protect their people from such a disaster. Within a generation or two, the great palaces of Crete began to show signs of decline and destruction. Around 1450 BCE, the palaces at Knossos, Phaistos, and Malea were violently destroyed, many by fire. This is where a new power enters the story: the Mycenaeans from mainland Greece. For centuries, the Mycenaeans have been the cultural and military junior partners to the Minoans. Archaeologists now widely believe that the eruption of Thera weakened the Minoans so severely that they became an easy target for Mycenaean conquest. The Mycenaeans, a more warlike society, took advantage of the power vacuum, invading Crete and occupying the island, particularly the palace at Knossos. They adopted elements of Minoan culture, but imposed their own more militaristic and bureaucratic rule. The final death knell of the Minoan civilization was not the volcano itself, but the human opportunism that followed in its wake. Despite decades of research, one of the most perplexing aspects of the Thera eruption is the exact date of the event. A significant controversy exists between the traditional archaeological chronology and the scientific dating methods. Archaeologists, based on pottery styles and synchronisms with Egyptian history, have traditionally placed the eruption around 1500 BCE. However, radiocarbon dating of organic remains found buried in the eruption ash, along with dendrochronology and ice core data, consistently points to an earlier date, between 1627 and 1600 BCE. This discrepancy of over a century has profound implications for our understanding of the entire Bronze Age world and its timeline. Resolving this dating conflict is crucial for historians, as it would realign the chronologies of the Minoans, Mycenaeans, Egyptians, and Hittites. If the scientific date is correct, many long-held assumptions about interactions between these civilizations must be re-evaluated. For example, it would mean the eruption occurred during the Hyksos period in Egypt, not during the powerful 18th dynasty as previously thought. This debate highlights the ongoing challenge of integrating different types of evidence, artistic, textual, and scientific, to build an accurate picture of the ancient past. It is a puzzle where every new discovery can potentially shift the entire historical landscape. The sheer scale and drama of the Thera eruption have inevitably led to speculation that it was the historical basis for one of the most famous legends of all time, the story of Atlantis. First recounted by the Greek philosopher Plato around 360 BCE, Atlantis was described as a powerful, advanced island civilization in the Atlantic that was swallowed by the sea in a single day and night of catastrophic floods. Many scholars have drawn striking parallels between Plato's account and the archaeological and geological reality of the Minoan world and Thera. The Minoans were a sophisticated island culture, and the concentric rings of land and water described by Atlantis bear a resemblance to the shape of the caldera of Santorini. Furthermore, the sudden apocalyptic destruction of Akrotiri and the subsequent decline of the Minoan civilization echo the fate of Plato's fabled island. The theory suggests that the story of Atlantis was not a pure invention, but a garbled, mythologized memory of the Thera eruption, passed down through Egyptian records and eventually to Plato. The destruction of a great maritime power by fire and water is a powerful narrative that could have been preserved and embellished over centuries. However, this hypothesis remains highly controversial, with many critics pointing to inconsistencies such as the location and size of Atlantis. Whether fact or fiction, the Atlantis connection adds a layer of enduring myth to the historical reality of the Minoan apocalypse. Ultimately, the story of the Thera eruption is a stark reminder of the fragility of human civilization in the face of nature's overwhelming power. The Minoans were not a primitive people. They were artists, engineers, and explorers who created a brilliant and sophisticated culture. Yet, all of their achievements were insufficient to save them from a geological event of planetary proportions. The eruption did not simply destroy a city. It triggered a domino effect of tsunamis, climate change, economic collapse, and invasion that brought down an entire civilization. It reshaped the political landscape of the ancient Aegean, paving the way for the rise of Mycenaean Greece and, eventually, the foundations of Western civilization. Today, the stunning cliffs of Santorini stand as a beautiful and terrifying monument to this ancient catastrophe. Beneath the feet of tourists, the perfectly preserved ruins of Akrotiri lie waiting to reveal more of their secrets. The Minoan civilization may have fallen, but its influence on art, architecture, and myth endured long after its palaces crumbled. The true shock of the Thera event is not just its violence, but its profound demonstration of how quickly and completely a world can be turned upside down. It is a lesson written in ash and stone, a testament to a lost world, and the warning from our own planet's deep, unpredictable past. While one ancient world was buried under volcanic ash, another was sinking beneath the waves, carrying with it a secret so advanced it would challenge our entire understanding of antiquity. In the spring of 1900, a group of Greek sponge divers was blown off course by a storm near the tiny island of Antikythera between Crete and the Peloponnese. Seeking shelter, they dove into the waters and stumbled upon a horrifying sight. A massive shipwreck, littered with human and animal bones and encrusted with the treasures of a bygone era. This was not just any shipwreck. It was a Roman-era vessel, a time capsule from the 1st century BCE, filled with bronze and marble statues, fine pottery, and glassware. Among these classical treasures, however, was one object that did not belong, an artifact so out of place it would take decades to comprehend. Initially, the divers retrieved spectacular artifacts, including bronze statues like the famed Antikythera youth, which were sent to the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. It was only during a second expedition, a few months later, that a seemingly insignificant find was brought to the surface. A corroded lump of bronze, no larger than a shoebox, which had broken into several pieces during its recovery. This unassuming object, catalogued simply as a piece of bronze, sat in the museum storeroom for months, attracting little attention. Slowly, as the encrustation fell away, conservators noticed something astonishing. Inside the bronze fragments were a series of interlocking gears, clearly visible through the cracks. This was not a statue or a simple tool. It was a machine, and its existence in the ancient world was an impossibility. The enigma of the device languished for over half a century as scholars struggled to understand its function without damaging the fragile, corroded object. The true investigation began in earnest in the 1950s, when a British physicist and historian of science named Derek de Solla Price became fascinated by the artifact. Using primitive X-ray technology, Price was able to peer inside the complex mechanism and create a working model of its internal structure. What he revealed sent a shockwave through the academic community, for this was not a simple astrolabe or calendar, but an astonishingly sophisticated analog computer. Price's analysis proved that the ancient Greeks had possessed a level of mechanical engineering skill that was not thought to exist until the Renaissance in Europe. Modern research, utilizing high-resolution CT scanning and 3D X-ray imaging, has revealed even more about the device's incredible capabilities, confirming and expanding upon Price's initial findings. The mechanism, now known as the Antikythera mechanism, was essentially an astronomical calculator designed to predict celestial events and cycles with remarkable accuracy. Its main dial represented the solar year, while a smaller inner dial tracked the 4-year cycle of the Olympic Games and other Pan-Hellenic festivals. On the back of the device were 2 spiral dials. One showed the lunar cycle and predicted eclipses, while the other is believed to have tracked the long, irregular cycles of the planets visible to the naked eye: Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. The ability to predict eclipses was a powerful tool in the ancient world, allowing rulers to claim divine authority and omens, and the mechanism could forecast them with incredible precision. The Greeks understood that eclipses occurred in predictable cycles, known as the Saros cycle, which lasts approximately 18 years, and the mechanism incorporated this complex knowledge. Furthermore, the device accounted for the Moon's elliptical orbit around the Earth, a variation known as the first lunar anomaly, through a remarkably elegant mechanical solution. This genius engineering feat demonstrated a theoretical understanding of astronomy and a practical ability to model it that was simply unheard of for this period. The sheer intellectual power embedded in this single object is staggering. Perhaps the most shocking feature of the Antikythera mechanism is its use of a differential gear, a complex gear system that allows the calculation of the difference between 2 rotational speeds. This specific technology was previously thought to have been invented in the 16th century by clockmakers in Europe. Yet here it was, definitively present in a device from over 1,000 years earlier. The differential gear was used to model the varying speed of the Moon as it orbits the Earth, a subtle astronomical detail that required sophisticated mathematical and mechanical insight. The mechanism contains at least 30 bronze gears of various sizes, all meshing together with perfect precision to simulate the movements of the cosmos. The level of miniaturization and the intricate craftsmanship of the gears are comparable to the finest clocks made in the 18th century. To put this discovery in perspective, for centuries historians believed that the technological capabilities of the Greeks and Romans were limited to simple machines like levers, screws, and gears used in basic contexts. The Antikythera mechanism shatters this perception, revealing a previously unknown tradition of high-precision, complex scientific instrument making. It is a mechanical cosmos, a tangible representation of the geocentric, Earth-centered astronomical model proposed by Claudius Ptolemy, though the mechanism predates his work. This single artifact suggests that the path of technological history was not a simple linear progression, but one with forgotten branches and lost potential. The existence of this ancient computer implies a lineage of knowledge and skill that has been completely erased from the historical record. Adding to its complexity, the exterior of the mechanism was covered with thousands of characters of Greek text, inscribed on thin bronze plates that served as an instruction manual for the device. The inscriptions provided a user guide, explaining the dials, the cycles they represented, and the celestial bodies being tracked. For decades, this text was almost impossible to read due to the artifact's condition, but modern surface imaging and polynomial texture mapping have allowed scientists to decipher much of it. These inscriptions are not just labels, they contain detailed astronomical information and are the earliest known surviving Greek scientific prose. They confirm that the device was a serious scientific instrument, not merely a decorative curiosity. The question of who built this marvel remains a subject of intense debate among historians and archaeologists, though most agree it was the product of the brilliant scientific community of Hellenistic Greece. The mechanism's construction is dated to around 150 BCE, and many scholars point to the astronomer Hipparchus of Rhodes, who lived at that time, as a possible designer. Hipparchus developed the theory of epicycles to explain planetary motion, and was the first to calculate the precession of the equinoxes, both concepts embodied in the mechanism's gearwork. Some have even speculated a connection to the great Archimedes of Syracuse, who is said to have built a planetarium, though the mechanism was likely made long after his death. The shipwreck itself provides clues to the mechanism's origin, as it was a Roman vessel carrying a cargo of luxury goods, likely looted from Greece and en route to Rome. The ship may have been part of a vast fortune amassed by General Sulla during his campaigns in the East, suggesting the mechanism was a highly prized object taken as war booty. The presence of objects from across the eastern Mediterranean indicates the mechanism could have been made in a major Hellenistic center like Rhodes, Pergamon, or Alexandria. These cities were hubs of scientific inquiry, where the brightest minds of the age pushed the boundaries of mathematics, astronomy, and engineering. The Antikythera mechanism was undoubtedly the pinnacle of this intellectual tradition. This leads to the most profound and haunting questions surrounding the discovery. Why was this revolutionary technology lost? Why did this brilliant mechanical tradition die out, leaving no trace in the archaeological or historical record for over 1,000 years? One theory suggests that such devices were incredibly rare and expensive, the exclusive domain of the wealthy elite, and were never mass-produced. Perhaps they were considered philosophical novelties or oracular tools, rather than practical instruments with wider applications. Another possibility is that the craft was so specialized that it was passed down through a very small lineage of artisans, and this knowledge was simply extinguished by war, plague, or social upheaval. It is also possible that the Antikythera mechanism was not unique, but part of a larger, now lost family of similar devices. The Roman author Cicero, writing in the 1st century BCE, mentions seeing two such instruments, one made by Archimedes and another by Posidonius, which accurately reproduced the daily movements of the sun, moon, and 5 planets. If these accounts are true, then the Antikythera find is not a miraculous fluke, but the sole surviving example of an entire genre of ancient mechanical wonders. The bronze from which such devices were made was highly valuable and was often recycled, which could explain why other mechanisms have not survived. The Antikythera mechanism may have been preserved only because it was lost at sea before it could be melted down. The discovery of the Antikythera mechanism is a humbling reminder that the past is often far more complex and surprising than we give it credit for. It forces a radical reevaluation of what the ancient Greeks and Romans were capable of, revealing a scientific and technological sophistication that rivals that of much later eras. This single, corroded piece of bronze has rewritten the history of technology, proving that the intellectual journey towards the modern world was not a straight line, but a winding path with forgotten roads and lost destinations. The true shock of the mechanism is not just its engineering genius, but the realization of how much knowledge from the ancient world has truly vanished, leaving us only tantalizing clues to its former glory. The shock of a lost technological marvel pales in comparison to the arrival of a biological force of unimaginable scale, an event that ripped through the known world with terrifying speed. Between the years 1347 and 1351, a pandemic swept across Asia, North Africa, and Europe, killing an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the population. This cataclysm, known as the Black Death, was not merely a disaster, but a fundamental reset button for civilization, reshaping its social, economic, and religious foundations. It was a shock that came not from the sea or the earth, but from within the bodies of the very people it afflicted. The world before the plague was unrecognizable from the world that emerged in its aftermath. The prevailing scientific consensus traces the origins of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the plague, to the rodent populations of the Tian Shan region on the border of modern-day Kyrgyzstan and China. From this natural reservoir, the disease likely followed the well-trodden paths of the Silk Road, infecting merchant caravans and the communities through which they passed. By the early 14th century, the plague had reached the shores of the Black Sea, where it encountered a new and potent vector for global transmission: Mediterranean trade networks. The bacterium found its way into the bustling trading ports controlled by Italian merchant republics like Genoa and Venice. It was at the Crimean port of Kaffa that the pandemic would find its grim ticket to Europe. In 1346, the Mongol Golden Horde, besieging the Genoese-held city of Kaffa, found their army decimated by a mysterious and terrifying disease. According to the account of Gabriele de Mussi, the besieging Mongols made a fateful and horrifying decision, catapulting the corpses of their plague-infected soldiers over the city walls. This act is often cited as one of the earliest documented instances of biological warfare. The disease quickly spread within the crowded confines of the city, creating a panic among the Genoese defenders. A handful of Genoese ships, laden with goods and now unknowingly carrying the infection, managed to escape the siege and set sail for their home ports, transporting the plague westward. In October of 1347, these ships arrived in the port of Messina in Sicily, and the true horror began. The terrified Sicilian authorities witnessed sailors covered in black, oozing swellings and in the throes of agonizing fever, dying with astonishing speed. When the ships were ordered to leave the harbor, it was already too late. The rats carrying the infected fleas had scurried ashore, and the disease had already been passed to the city's inhabitants. From Messina, the plague spread like a wildfire across the island, and then boarded ships for the Italian mainland. Within months, the great maritime republics of Genoa and Venice, the very cities that had unwittingly imported the disease, were in the grip of a full-blown epidemic. The true culprit behind this devastation was a bacterium that would not be identified until the 19th century during a later outbreak in Hong Kong. Yersinia pestis is primarily transmitted through the bite of an infected flea, which typically carries the pathogen after feeding on an infected rodent, most commonly the black rat. The bacterium then multiplies in the lymphatic system of its human host, leading to the first and most common form of the disease, bubonic plague, characterized by the painful swellings or buboes that give the plague its name. However, the disease could also manifest as septicemic plague, when the infection overwhelmed the bloodstream, and pneumonic plague when it infected the lungs, allowing for terrifyingly efficient person-to-person transmission through airborne droplets. The symptoms were a graphic and terrifying spectacle of the body's complete failure. A victim would first experience fever, chills, headaches, and a profound weakness, followed within days by the appearance of the buboes. These swollen lymph nodes, often found in the groin, armpit, or neck, would grow to the size of an apple or egg, hardening and turning a blackish-purple color as the flesh necrotized underneath. As the disease progressed, victims would suffer from vomiting, diarrhea, and intense pain, often slipping into a delirious or comatose state. Gangrene would often set in, turning the fingers, toes, and nose black, a condition known as acral gangrene, which contributed to the name, quote, death, when it came, usually arrived within a week of the first symptoms. The speed and totality of the plague spread across Europe were unprecedented, moving along trade and pilgrimage routes at a rate of 1 to 2 miles per day. All major cities were struck, with Florence losing up to 60% of its population, a tragedy famously chronicled by Giovanni Boccaccio in his work The Decameron. From Italy, the plague traveled northwest through France, reaching Paris by the spring of 1348 and then crossing the English Channel. By the end of the year, it had reached London, and by 1350 it had penetrated into the Scandinavian countries, Iceland, and even Greenland, leaving almost no corner of the continent untouched. The pandemic functioned like a grim, invisible army, marching relentlessly forward. The sheer scale of mortality caused a complete and total breakdown of the social order that had defined medieval Europe for centuries. In cities like Florence, as described by Boccaccio, the terror was so profound that family members abandoned one another, refusing to care for sick relatives or even bury the dead. Doctors, with their limited understanding of humoral theory and ineffective cures like bloodletting, were often the first to die or would flee, leaving the sick to fend for themselves. The dead piled up in the streets, and mass burial pits were dug as individual funerals became an impossible luxury. The plague did not just kill people, it annihilated the very structures of community and kinship. The psychological and religious impact of the Black Death was as profound as the demographic one. The Church, the central institution of medieval life, was rendered powerless, and its authority was deeply shaken. Prayer, penance, and pilgrimage offered no protection from the pestilence, leading many to question their faith and the righteousness of God. This crisis of faith gave rise to extreme movements, most notably the flagellants, bands of laypeople who traveled from town to town, publicly whipping themselves with iron-tipped whips. They believed that this ritual self-punishment was a form of collective atonement that might appease God's wrath and bring an end to the suffering. In the face of an inexplicable and unstoppable catastrophe, societies desperately sought a human scapegoat to blame, a pattern that would tragically repeat in later pandemics. Rumors began to circulate that the Black Death was a deliberate conspiracy, and Jewish communities across Europe were falsely accused of poisoning wells and spreading the disease. These baseless accusations were fueled by long-standing anti-Semitism and economic resentment, and they ignited a wave of horrific violence. In cities like Strasbourg and Basel, entire Jewish communities were rounded up and burned alive in wooden houses constructed for that purpose, massacres that occurred even as the plague itself had not yet arrived. Thousands of Jews were murdered in a frenzy of scapegoating, a dark stain on an already catastrophic period. The economic consequences of the Black Death were paradoxical and far-reaching, ultimately sowing the seeds for the decline of the medieval feudal system. The enormous loss of life created a severe and widespread labor shortage, as there were simply not enough peasants, artisans, and workers to tend the fields and practice the trades. For the first time in centuries, the surviving laborers found themselves in a position of unprecedented power. They could demand higher wages and better working conditions from desperate landowners. In England, this led to the Statute of Laborers in 1351, a failed attempt by the government to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, which only fueled resentment. This newfound economic leverage for the common person began to slowly erode the rigid hierarchies of feudalism, where serfs were bound to the land and subject to the will of their lord. With land abandoned and crops left to rot, lords were forced to compete for workers, offering freedoms and wages that were previously unthinkable. The scarcity of labor meant that land, long the primary source of wealth and power, lost some of its value, while the value of human labor increased dramatically. This economic empowerment of the lower classes was a direct shock to the established order and contributed to social unrest, most famously in the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The world of social relations had been fundamentally altered. The long-term cultural and intellectual legacy of the Black Death is complex, but many historians argue it was a crucial catalyst for the Renaissance. The massive death toll and the questioning of authority it engendered created a sense of memento mori, remember you must die. but also a new focus on the quality of life on Earth. The Church's diminished intellectual authority opened space for new ways of thinking about humanity and the world. Survivors, having stared into the abyss of death, often sought to embrace life with greater vigor, patronizing the arts and investing in worldly enterprises. The tragedy, in a grim twist, had cleared the way for a new flourishing of humanism and artistic expression. The medical world was also irrevocably changed as the plague exposed the utter inadequacy of the prevailing Galenic medical theories which had dominated for over 1,000 years. The humoral theory, which posited that illness was caused by an imbalance of the four humors, offered no effective explanation or treatment for the pestilence. In response, doctors and public officials began to develop the very first measures of public health, most notably the practice of quarantine, derived from the Venetian 40 giorni, or 40 days, that ships were required to wait in isolation before docking. Cities began to establish boards of health to regulate sanitation and combat the spread of disease. These were the rudimentary beginnings of modern epidemiology. Despite centuries of study, some aspects of the Black Death remain shrouded in mystery and debate, adding to its enduring fascination. While Yersinia pestis is the confirmed culprit, some historians argue that other diseases, such as anthrax or a viral hemorrhagic fever, may have been involved, accounting for the incredible speed of person-to-person transmission described by contemporary accounts. The exact mortality toll is also impossible to calculate with certainty, with estimates varying wildly from 30% to over 60% of Europe's population. Furthermore, the question of why the pandemic eventually receded, only to return in waves for centuries, is not fully understood, though theories range from changes in the disease's virulence to the evolution of human immunity, or even the evolution of the rat and flea populations. The ultimate shock of the Black Death lies in its role as history's great accelerator. It did not start these changes, but it amplified them and sped them up dramatically. It fatally wounded the feudal system, fractured the absolute authority of the medieval church, and paved the way for the economic and intellectual transformations of the early modern era. The pandemic was a brutal biological sieve that filtered humanity, leaving behind a world that was poorer in numbers, but paradoxically richer in opportunity for those who survived. It stands as a terrifying testament to the fragility of human society and the awesome, indifferent power of nature. The Black Death was more than a killer. It was the creator of a new world, born from the ashes of the old. The world, reshaped by biological catastrophe, would soon learn that profound shocks could also arrive from the cold, silent void above. On the morning of June 30th, 1908, a remote corner of Siberia, near the stony Tunguska River, was the epicenter of an event of unimaginable force. At around 7:17 in the morning, a blinding blue-white light, described as being as bright as a second sun, flashed across the sky. This was followed minutes later by a series of thunderous explosions, so powerful that they were heard hundreds of miles away. A massive shockwave flattened an estimated 80 million trees over an area of more than 2,000 square kilometers. For the indigenous Evenki people living and hunting in the taiga, the experience was one of pure terror. Witnesses recounted being thrown violently to the ground by the blast wave, with the heat so intense it singed their clothing and caused skin to peel. The forest, their home and livelihood, was instantly transformed into a chaotic graveyard of splintered, fallen trees, all pointing away from a central epicenter. Some reported seeing the sky split open by a pillar of fire, an image that would be seared into their collective memory. The sound was not a single boom, but a continuous, ear-splitting roar, like artillery fire overlapping for minutes. They believed their god, Agdi, had sent a fire demon to destroy the world. Despite the sheer scale of the explosion, the world at large remained largely oblivious for nearly 2 decades. The immense remoteness of the impact zone, coupled with the political turmoil in Russia, including the 1905 revolution, the First World War, and the subsequent Bolshevik Revolution, meant that there was no immediate official investigation. The Tunguska event was a mystery that lay buried under millions of fallen trees in a place few people had ever been. However, the event did register on scientific instruments across the globe. Seismic stations in London and as far away as Washington, D.C. detected strong tremors, while barometers in England recorded powerful pressure waves that circled the entire planet not once but twice. It was not until 1921 that the story finally captured the attention of the scientific community, thanks to the tireless efforts of a Russian mineralogist named Leonid Kulik. While working for the Soviet Academy of Sciences, Kulik came across scattered witness accounts of a great fireball and explosion in Siberia. He became convinced that the event was caused by a massive meteorite impact, and he theorized that finding it could provide a huge source of iron for the fledgling Soviet Union. Kulik dedicated the next decade of his life to securing funding and organizing expeditions to this extremely isolated and hazardous region. His quest was not for scientific knowledge alone, but for a prize he believed lay buried in the Siberian earth. Kulik's first expedition reached the general area in 1927, but the journey through the swampy, mosquito-infested taiga was brutal, and they were forced to turn back. He returned in 1928 with a better-equipped team, and it was during this expedition that they finally reached the epicenter of the devastation. The sight that greeted them was shocking and utterly unexpected. Instead of the large crater they were searching for, they found a vast, unnerving landscape of destruction. Trees were stripped of their branches and bark, lying in a radial pattern like matchsticks, all pointing away from a central point. The ground itself was scarred, but there was no hole, no impact basin, and no sign of the giant chunk of iron they were seeking. The absence of a crater became the central, defining mystery of the Tunguska event. Kulik was baffled and refused to believe the meteorite had vaporized. He theorized that it must have buried itself deep within the marshy ground, and so he and his team began digging trenches and drilling core samples. They found nothing but peat and rock. Over subsequent expeditions in the 1930s, Kulik systematically photographed the area, creating a stunning visual record of the flattening pattern, but he never found a single fragment of the meteorite. The Tunguska object, it seemed, had exploded without a trace, a conclusion that defied the known physics of the time and deepened the enigma. For decades after Kulik's death, the Tunguska event remained a scientific curiosity, an anomaly without a clear explanation. It was not until the Cold War era, with its intense interest in atmospheric explosions from nuclear testing, that a plausible theory began to emerge. Scientists started to model what would happen if a large object, like an asteroid or comet, were to explode in the air before hitting the ground. This phenomenon, known as an airburst, occurs when the immense pressure and heat of atmospheric entry causes a cosmic body to fragment and detonate high above the surface, releasing its energy in a colossal fireball. This model perfectly explained the massive blast wave, the intense heat, the radial tree pattern, and, most importantly, the complete lack of an impact crater. The next question was what kind of object had caused it, an asteroid or a comet? Modern analysis points strongly towards a stony or carbonaceous asteroid, perhaps 50 to 100 meters in diameter. According to this leading theory, the asteroid entered Earth's atmosphere at a shallow angle, traveling at tens of thousands of kilometers per hour. The friction heated the rock to thousands of degrees, causing it to fracture and explode at an altitude of 5 to 10 kilometers. The energy released was equivalent to a 15-megaton nuclear bomb, roughly 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Most of the object would have been vaporized into dust and fine particles, which then settled over the landscape. Further evidence supporting the cosmic origin was found decades later in the layers of peat and resin from trees that survived the blast. In the 1960s and 1970s, Russian scientists discovered tiny spherical particles of glass and metal within the 1908 peat layer. These spherules were rich in elements like iridium, nickel, and cobalt, which are rare in Earth's crust but common in extraterrestrial bodies. This provided the definitive chemical fingerprint that the explosion was not volcanic or man-made. The analysis of these microscopic remnants has allowed scientists to reconstruct the composition of the object, further reinforcing the asteroid airburst hypothesis as the most credible explanation. A stunning modern-day confirmation of this theory arrived on February 15, 2013, when a much smaller asteroid, about 20 meters in diameter, entered the atmosphere over Chelyabinsk, Russia. Like its predecessor over Tunguska, the Chelyabinsk meteor created a superbolide brighter than the Sun and exploded in an airburst at an altitude of nearly 30 kilometers. Its shockwave shattered thousands of windows and caused injuries, but again, no large impact crater was formed. This event, captured by countless dashcams and security cameras, provided a real-world demonstration of the very mechanism that scientists had long proposed for Tunguska, effectively solving the central mystery of how so much destruction could occur without an impact. Despite the scientific consensus, the sheer strangeness of the event, a massive explosion in the sky with no visible cause, has given rise to a host of more exotic and speculative theories. In the mid-20th century, as the UFO phenomenon captured the public imagination, some proposed that the Tunguska blast was not a natural object at all. One popular theory suggested it was an alien spacecraft, perhaps powered by a nuclear engine, which had suffered a catastrophic malfunction and exploded in mid-air. Proponents of this idea argued that this could explain the intense light, the lack of debris, and reports of anomalous radiation readings at the site, though no credible evidence for such a craft has ever been found. The scientific community has largely dismissed these fringe ideas, but others have been proposed by physicists exploring more exotic possibilities. In the 1970s, a brief but intense debate was sparked by the theory that the Tunguska event was caused by a miniature black hole passing through the Earth. According to this hypothesis, a tiny, incredibly dense object entered the atmosphere, creating the blast wave as it superheated the air and then exited the other side of the planet without stopping. However, no corresponding exit event was ever detected, and the theory is now considered highly improbable. Similarly, the idea that a chunk of antimatter annihilating with terrestrial matter could have caused the blast has been put forward, though it lacks any physical evidence to support it over the more conventional airburst model. Today, the primary legacy of the Tunguska event is as a powerful and sobering case study for planetary defense. It stands as the largest impact event in recorded history and serves as a stark reminder that Earth exists within a cosmic shooting gallery. The object that caused the devastation was relatively small, likely no bigger than a football stadium, and it came from an unexpected direction, evading detection. If an object of that size were to explode over a densely populated area, the casualties and destruction would be catastrophic. The Tunguska event was a cosmic shot across the bow, a warning that humanity cannot afford to ignore. In response to this threat, space agencies around the world have established programs to identify and track near-Earth objects, or NEOs. Telescopes on the ground and in space scan the heavens every night, building a catalog of potentially hazardous asteroids and comets. The goal is to provide early warning for any object on a collision course with Earth, giving us years or even decades to respond. Furthermore, missions like NASA's DART, Double Asteroid Redirection Test, are actively developing technologies to deflect an incoming asteroid, successfully demonstrating that we can alter an object's trajectory. These efforts are a direct consequence of the lessons learned from Tunguska. Even with modern technology, some questions about the 1908 event may never be answered with absolute certainty. The exact composition, density, and structure of the Tunguska body remain subjects of scientific debate and computer modeling. Why did it explode at the precise altitude it did, maximizing the blast effect on the surface? These details are lost to time, vaporized in the fireball. Yet the event continues to be a source of intense fascination for scientists and the public alike, representing a perfect fusion of hard science and enduring mystery. It is a story that bridges the gap between geology, astronomy, and history. The Tunguska event remains one of history's great environmental shocks, a natural disaster of cosmic origin that reshaped a vast landscape without leaving a crater. It demonstrated that a threat from space does not need to strike the ground to be devastatingly effective. The force that flattened the Siberian forest was not born of this world, a powerful and indifferent shock that reminded humanity of its fragile place in the universe. It was a silent, invisible killer that arrived without warning, changing our understanding of Earth's vulnerability forever. The world was shocked into looking up, realizing that the greatest dangers might not come from within, but from the starry expanse above. While the world was looking to the skies for its greatest shocks, a different kind of revelation lay buried deep within the Earth, waiting to upend our understanding of the ancient Americas. In the mid-19th century, as workers cleared land in the Mexican state of Tabasco, they stumbled upon something impossible: a gigantic stone head, half buried in the jungle soil. This was the first known encounter with a colossal Olmec head, a discovery so profound and so out of place with the prevailing views of the time that it was initially dismissed as a hoax. How could the indigenous peoples of the region have carved and moved such a monument, some weighing dozens of tons, without metal tools or beasts of burden? The very existence of these silent stone sentinels was a seismic shock to the foundations of New World archaeology. Modern research has confirmed that these monuments are the masterwork of the Olmec civilization, which flourished in the tropical lowlands of the Gulf Coast of Mexico from approximately 1400 BCE to 400 BCE. The Olmec are now widely regarded as the, quote, eight of Mesoamerica, laying the groundwork for the later, more famous Maya and Aztec civilizations. Their heartland was a challenging environment of dense rainforest, swamps, and winding rivers, a place where they built major ceremonial centers like San Lorenzo, La Venta, and Tres Zapotes. It was at these sites that the majority of the 17 known colossal heads have been found, each one a testament to the power and sophistication of this enigmatic people. Their emergence from the earth was a shock that forced a complete rewriting of early American history. Each colossal head is a unique and individualized portrait, carved from a single massive block of basalt, a hard volcanic rock. The heads are not generic representations, but depict distinct individuals with different facial features, expressions, and elaborate headgear. The smallest heads weigh around 6 tons, while the largest, discovered at La Venta, weighs an estimated 50 tons. The sheer scale of these sculptures is breathtaking. Some stand nearly 3 meters tall, towering over any human being. The meticulous craftsmanship is equally shocking, with the Olmec sculptors achieving a lifelike quality and a powerful presence that resonates even 3,000 years later. The most baffling question surrounding the colossal heads is not who they depict, but how they were made and transported. The basalt quarries from which the stone was sourced have been traced to the Tuxtlas Mountains, located over 100 kilometers from the Olmec heartland of San Lorenzo. This means the Olmec had to move enormous multi-ton boulders down from the mountains, across rugged terrain, and then transport them through dense jungle and swamp to their ceremonial centers. Leading archaeologists believe this monumental task was accomplished using a combination of sheer manpower, log rollers, and perhaps most ingeniously, by floating the massive stones on rafts along the Coatzacoalcos River. The logistical organization required for such an operation, for a society without the wheel, is a shocking display of engineering and social control. The tools the Olmec used to shape this incredibly hard stone add another layer of mystery to their achievement. They possessed no metal tools more advanced than copper, which is too soft to carve basalt. Instead, evidence suggests they relied on a painstaking process of pounding and grinding using harder stones such as jadeite or granodiorite to slowly peck away at the basalt surface. Water and sand were likely used as abrasives to smooth and polish the stone to its final finish. This labor-intensive method would have required hundreds, if not thousands of man-hours to complete a single head, highlighting the immense value and importance placed on these monuments. The skill and patience demonstrated represent a technological shock, a mastery of stoneworking that seems almost impossible for their era. The identity of the individuals portrayed in the colossal heads remains the subject of intense scholarly debate, though a prevailing theory has emerged. The dominant view among experts like Dr. Michael D. Coe is that the heads are portraits of specific Olmec rulers, capturing their likenesses for eternity. The distinct facial features, from furrowed brows to slightly parted lips, lend credence to this idea, suggesting they are not gods but powerful men. The elaborate headdresses worn by each figure are thought to represent their individual status, their role as a ball player, or perhaps the specific emblem of their dynasty. These were not just abstract symbols of power, they were the faces of a human-led authority, a shocking concept in a world often ruled by deified monarchs. The discovery of these heads in the early 20th century by archaeologists like Matthew Stirling was a turning point in Mesoamerican studies. The sheer existence of such sophisticated art from a period so early shocked the academic community, which had previously assumed complex societies only emerged much later in the region. Stirling's meticulous excavations at Tres Zapotes and La Venta provided the critical context that dated the Olmec civilization and cemented its place as the progenitor of Mesoamerican culture. The heads became iconic symbols of this ancient world, challenging Eurocentric biases about the capabilities of pre-Columbian civilizations. They were a shock, not just of art, but of historical chronology. The purpose of the colossal heads within Olmec society was likely multifaceted, serving as both political propaganda and sacred objects. They were strategically placed in plazas and ceremonial courtyards, where they would have been seen by the populace, reinforcing the power and lineage of the ruling elite. Yet, their fate was not always one of eternal display. Archaeologists have found evidence that some heads were deliberately defaced and then ritually buried. This suggests they played a role in ancestor veneration, or that the destruction of a predecessor's monument was part of a succession ritual. This cycle of veneration and destruction adds a profound, almost spiritual dimension to their existence, a shocking insight into the complex rituals of Olmec power. The artistic style of the colossal heads had a lasting and undeniable influence on subsequent Mesoamerican civilizations. Traits often associated with the Olmec, such as the quote nine motif, broad noses, and fleshy lips, can be seen in the art of the Maya and the Zapotec. The very concept of massive stone sculpture as a tool for legitimation of power was adopted and adapted by these later cultures. The Olmec established a visual and political vocabulary that would endure for over 2,000 years, a testament to the foundational shock of their cultural innovations. The faces of their kings echoed through time, shaping the art and ideology of an entire region. Later theories, now largely discredited by mainstream science, proposed alternative origins for the Olmec and their colossal heads, driven in part by racial prejudices of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Some observers, struck by the broad noses and full lips of the sculptures, suggested they were evidence of pre-Columbian contact from Africa. This hypothesis has been overwhelmingly rejected by archaeologists and geneticists, as there is no supporting evidence of African DNA, language, or technology in the region. Instead, the features of the heads are now understood as a realistic depiction of the indigenous Mesoamerican physical type, a powerful refutation of those who sought to deny the achievements of Native American civilizations. Each head tells a story, not just of a ruler, but of the entire society that produced it. The effort required to quarry, transport, and carve a single head would have been a massive undertaking, mobilizing a significant portion of the community's resources. This implies a highly centralized and hierarchical political structure, capable of directing labor on a colossal scale. It also points to a sophisticated understanding of geology, engineering, and project management. The heads are therefore not just art. They are physical manifestations of Olmec social, political, and economic complexity, a shocking display of organizational prowess that rivals that of ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. The Olmec civilization itself remains shrouded in mystery, with no written language to directly tell its story. We do not know the names of their kings, the titles they held, or the specific events they presided over. The colossal heads are our most direct connection to these lost individuals, silent stone witnesses to a forgotten history. Everything we know about them is interpreted through their art, their ruins, and the archaeological record. This lack of definitive answers is what makes the Olmecs so compelling. They are a civilization defined more by the questions they raise than the answers they provide. Their silence is as profound as their presence was shocking. In recent decades, advanced technologies like LiDAR, light detection and ranging, have begun to reveal the true scale of Olmec settlement in the Gulf Coast lowlands. By scanning the jungle canopy from aircraft, researchers have been able to map vast, previously unknown networks of causeways, platforms, and residential compounds surrounding the major ceremonial centers. These findings suggest that the Olmec population was far larger and more urbanized than ever before imagined, the true scale of their cities a modern shock. This new context reframes the colossal heads not as isolated monuments in the wilderness, but as the focal points of bustling, complex metropolises. The fall of the Olmec civilization around 400 BCE is as mysterious as its rise. Their major centers were deliberately dismantled, and their monuments, including some of the colossal heads, were ritually buried before the sites were abandoned. The reasons for this collapse remain debated, with theories ranging from internal revolts and environmental degradation to shifts in trade routes. Whatever the cause, the decline of the Olmec did not erase their influence. Instead, their cultural and religious innovations were absorbed and transformed by the emerging cultures across Mesoamerica, ensuring their legacy would live on. The creators of the colossal heads vanished, but their ideas shaped a continent. Today, the colossal heads stand as some of the most powerful and evocative artifacts from the ancient world. They are housed in museums in Mexico City, Villahermosa, and even in international collections, where they continue to awe and inspire millions of visitors. Their stoic expressions gaze out across the millennia, a silent challenge to our modern assumptions about the past. They are a shocking reminder that history is not a linear, predictable path, but a story filled with brilliant, unexpected bursts of creativity and ingenuity. The stone faces are a bridge to a lost world, a world of power, ritual, and artistic genius. The ultimate shock of the Olmec colossal heads is their humanity. In an age of gods and myths, they chose to immortalize mortal men, capturing their individuality in stone. This act of portraiture, on such a monumental scale, is a profound statement about the nature of power and legacy. It suggests a society that revered its human leaders as much as its deities, seeing them as the essential link between the earthly and the divine. The heads force us to confront the people of the past not as abstract concepts, but as living, breathing individuals with faces, names, and stories that we can now only guess at. A shocking and deeply humbling realization. From the silent, stone-faced shock of a long-lost civilization, we pivot to a 20th century detonation that echoed across the globe. A shock not of discovery, but of terrifying creation. In the midst of the deadliest conflict in human history, a secret race was underway, a competition to unleash the fundamental power of the universe. This was the Manhattan Project, a monumental American, British, and Canadian scientific and military enterprise. Its singular goal was to develop a weapon of unimaginable force, drawn from the very heart of the atom. This endeavor would culminate in an event that marked the definitive end of one era and the violent, precarious dawn of another. The chosen stage for this unprecedented event was a desolate corner of the New Mexico desert, a place ominously named the Journey of the Dead Man. Its stark, unforgiving landscape, a flat expanse of sand and scrub, was deemed perfect for its isolation. The remoteness promised secrecy from enemy spies and a relative safety for the surrounding population in case of catastrophe. Here, under the vast, open skies of the American Southwest, humanity would play God. The site itself was given a code name, Trinity, a term chosen by the project's lead, J. Robert Oppenheimer, a name that carried with it layers of religious and poetic meaning. At the helm of this scientific crusade was Oppenheimer himself, a brilliant, charismatic, and deeply conflicted theoretical physicist. He assembled a team of the world's brightest minds at a hastily constructed secret laboratory high in the Pajarito Mountains of Los Alamos. This isolated city became the epicenter of intellectual ferment and immense psychological pressure, as these scientists grappled with problems no one had ever before attempted to solve. Oppenheimer, a man with a deep appreciation for literature and philosophy, was acutely aware of the profound moral implications of their work. He was the modern Prometheus, tasked by the state with stealing fire from the heavens, fully aware that he might be consumed by the blaze. The device they constructed was a masterpiece of engineering and theoretical physics, a grotesque assemblage of wires, explosives, and a newly discovered element. It was not a simple bomb, but an intricate, one-of-a-kind mechanism, an implosion-type weapon that had never been tested. At its core was a sphere of plutonium, a metal so rare and toxic that only microscopic amounts had ever been seen before the project. Surrounding this core were precisely shaped blocks of conventional high explosives, designed to fire inwards with perfect synchronicity. The theory was that this symmetrical blast wave would compress the plutonium core to critical mass, initiating a chain reaction of unimaginable energy. The entire concept was a terrifying gamble, built on complex equations and experimental hope. In the final days before the test, a massive steel tower, 100 feet tall, was erected at ground zero, and the gadget was hoisted to its pinnacle. An intense thunderstorm system swept through the area, causing agonizing delays and frayed nerves as the device sat exposed to the elements. Scientists and soldiers worked tirelessly, making final connections and performing last-minute checks in the pouring rain. The tension was palpable. A nearby lightning strike could conceivably detonate the device prematurely. As the storm finally passed in the pre-dawn hours of July 16, 1945, a final weather report gave the tentative go-ahead, setting the stage for a moment that would redefine history. At 5:29 in the morning, the final countdown commenced in a concrete control bunker 10,000 yards from the tower. The key figures of the project were at their designated posts, some in bunkers, others at a base camp even further away, watching through protective glasses. A profound silence fell over the desert as the final seconds ticked away, a silence broken only by the voice of the announcer counting down. At 0, a switch was thrown, sending a firing signal racing through the complex wiring to the detonators. In that instant, the world held its breath, unaware that it was about to witness the birth of the atomic age. The first sign was not a sound, but a light, a flash of such impossible intensity that it illuminated every peak and crevice of the surrounding mountain range as if it were the middle of the day. This searing white light, brighter than a dozen suns, bleached the colors from the landscape and vaporized the steel tower instantaneously, leaving it to exist only as a radioactive gas. The light was followed by a fireball that expanded rapidly, changing from a blinding white to a sickly purple, then to a brilliant, terrifying orange. A few seconds later, a crushing shockwave, hotter than the surface of the sun, ripped across the desert floor, flattening everything in its path, and finally reaching the observers with a sound like the crack of doom. From the base camp, the reaction was a mixture of awe, relief, and sheer terror. The initial stunned silence was broken by cheers, but these were quickly tempered by the horrifying spectacle unfolding before them. The most famous recollection comes from Oppenheimer himself, who later said a line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, flashed into his mind. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Kenneth Bainbridge, the director of the test, turned to Oppenheimer and shook his hand, saying, "Now we are all sons of bitches," a grim summation of their shared success and damnation. The shock was not merely visual or auditory. It was a deep, seismic shock to the human soul. In the minutes and hours that followed the detonation, teams of scientists in lead-lined Sherman tanks and protective gear ventured toward ground zero to assess the results. They found a crater of fused, glassy soil, a quarter-mile wide, where the desert sand had been melted by the immense heat. This newly formed, mildly radioactive mineral was given the name trinitite. Geiger counters clicked furiously, and measurements confirmed the blast had yielded a force equivalent to over 20,000 tons of TNT, a figure that exceeded even the most optimistic predictions. The scientific success was absolute. The device had worked flawlessly, and its destructive power was beyond anyone's wildest, most terrifying dreams. The political shockwaves from Trinity traveled even faster than the physical ones. A coded message was immediately sent to Washington, and from there to President Harry S. Truman, who was attending the Potsdam Conference with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin. This news fundamentally altered the balance of global power in an instant, giving the United States a powerful, if temporary, monopoly on a weapon of mass destruction. The knowledge of this successful test emboldened Truman in his negotiations and directly influenced the subsequent decision to deploy atomic bombs against the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Trinity test was, in essence, the first shot of the Cold War. The dawn of the nuclear age introduced a new and permanent state of anxiety into the human condition, a shock from which we have never fully recovered. The world was suddenly split into nuclear, "15," and "16," leading to a frantic and desperate arms race as the Soviet Union scrambled to build its own device. The concept of "17" or MAD became a terrifying geopolitical reality, a strategy that held the survival of civilization in a delicate, terrifying balance. For the first time in history, humanity possessed the means not just to wage war, but to render its own planet uninhabitable, a truly shocking and humbling power. The ethical and philosophical questions raised by the Trinity test continue to resonate to this day, forming the core of the 30% of its story that remains shrouded in debate and interpretation. Did the scientists, in their rush to beat the Nazis, fully comprehend the Pandora's box they were opening? Oppenheimer, the celebrated father of the bomb, would later become a vocal advocate for international control of nuclear weapons and an outspoken opponent of the even more powerful hydrogen bomb. The Trinity site stands today as a national historic landmark, a silent, empty place where humanity first learned to split the atom with catastrophic force. It remains a profound and shocking monument to our ingenuity, our hubris, and our endless capacity for both creation and destruction. The atomic shockwave that birthed the Cold War would take over 4 decades to finally dissipate, not with a bang, but with the joyful clamor of chisels on concrete. For a generation, the world had been defined by a bipolar standoff, a terrifying chess match between two nuclear superpowers. At the very heart of this global divide, both literal and symbolic, stood the Berlin Wall, a scar of concrete and barbed wire splitting a city and a continent. It was the ultimate icon of the Iron Curtain, a fortified barrier that represented the ideological chasm between East and West. Its existence was a constant simmering shock, a daily reminder of a world torn asunder. This monstrosity, erected in 1961, was more than just a wall. It was a complex and lethal killing machine. It consisted of 2 concrete walls with a 160-yard-wide death strip in between, littered with raked sand to show footprints, anti-vehicle trenches, and a flood-lit no-man's land. Over 160 watchtowers stood vigil, armed guards with orders to shoot anyone attempting to cross, and thousands of landmines lined the perimeter. According to historians at the Berlin Wall Memorial, at least 140 people died trying to cross it, their fates a brutal testament to the regime's desperation. The wall was therefore not merely a border, but a prison wall designed to lock in millions of citizens, preventing them from fleeing to the west. By the mid-1980s, however, the foundations of this seemingly permanent structure were beginning to tremble, shaken by forces both internal and external. The Soviet Union, the hegemon of the Eastern Bloc, was buckling under the immense weight of a protracted and unwinnable arms race. Its centrally planned economy was stagnant, inefficient, and unable to provide a basic standard of living for its people, leading to widespread disillusionment. Modern research from economic historians shows that Soviet military spending was consuming up to 25% of its GDP, a crippling figure that starved other sectors. The system was rotting from within, and its leader, a relatively young and dynamic reformer named Mikhail Gorbachev, knew it. When Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he introduced two revolutionary and shockingly liberal concepts: glasnost, or openness, and perestroika, meaning restructuring. Glasnost encouraged a degree of public criticism and freedom of expression previously unthinkable in the Soviet sphere, allowing long-buried historical truths and current problems to be discussed. Perestroika was an attempt to modernize and decentralize the failing Soviet economy, introducing elements of a market system. By the opinion of leading political scientists, these policies were intended to save communism, not destroy it. Instead, they inadvertently unleashed a wave of popular dissent that the weakened state could no longer contain. The most significant portentous shift was the abandonment of the so-called Brezhnev Doctrine, which had justified Soviet military intervention in satellite states to keep them in the communist orbit. In its place, Gorbachev promoted the Sinatra Doctrine, a tongue-in-cheek reference to Frank Sinatra's quote, suggesting Eastern European countries were now free to determine their own paths. This was a seismic change, a green light to dissident movements across the Eastern Bloc that the Red Army would no longer intervene to crush their aspirations for freedom. The first major crack appeared in Poland, where the Solidarity trade union movement, led by Lech Walesa, forced the government into round-table talks. By the summer of 1989, Poland had a non-communist prime minister, a stunning shock that reverberated throughout the region. The next, and perhaps most critical breach, occurred along the border between Hungary and Austria, a frontier that had been heavily fortified for decades. On the 19th of August, 1989, a Quote 21 was organized near the town of Sopron, a peace demonstration with a symbolic cutting of the border fence. In an astonishing and largely unplanned move, Hungarian border guards opened the gates, allowing hundreds of East Germans vacationing in Hungary to flee into the West. This event was a cataclysmic shock to the East German regime, as it provided the first viable escape route for its citizens. Within days, thousands more East Germans were traveling to Hungary, camping near the border, and waiting for their chance to cross to freedom. The flood of refugees became an uncontainable crisis for the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, exposing the deep unpopularity of its hardline communist government under Erich Honecker. Embassies in West Germany and Czechoslovakia were overwhelmed by East Germans seeking asylum, creating diplomatic nightmares for the regime. At the same time, a grassroots protest movement was gaining incredible momentum within East Germany itself, centered in the city of Leipzig. Every Monday evening, people would gather at St. Nicholas Church, initially to pray for peace, but soon the protests spilled into the streets. The chants grew bolder, from Quote 22 quote to Quote 23 quote, a powerful assertion of their right to demand change in their own country. By October of 1989, the Monday demonstrations in Leipzig had swelled from a few hundred participants to over 300,000, a truly shocking display of popular dissent in a totalitarian state. The East German leadership was paralyzed. Honecker wanted to use force, but he was no longer certain he had the backing of a now reformist Moscow. Gorbachev made it clear during a visit to East Berlin that the USSR would not support a crackdown, famously stating that Quote 24 quote, faced with this internal collapse of authority, Honecker was forced to resign in mid-October, replaced by the slightly less hardline Egon Krenz. The new government hoped that limited reforms would pacify the masses, but the pressure for true freedom, including the right to travel, was now unstoppable. The final, shocking act of this drama was not orchestrated by presidents or protesters, but unfolded through a series of blunders and misunderstandings on the evening of November 9, 1989. The East German government had decided to enact a new, more liberal travel regulation to ease the pressure, allowing citizens to apply for passports and travel abroad. To announce the decision, a press conference was called for that evening, featuring the party's spokesperson, Gunter Schabowski, a mid-level official who had not been deeply involved in the discussions. He was handed a sheaf of papers just before going on stage, a document he had barely had time to read.
The press conference was tense and largely uneventful until near the end, when an Italian journalist, Riccardo Erman, asked the fateful question, "When will the new travel rules take effect?" Schabowski, clearly flustered and unprepared, shuffled through his papers, mumbled something about a recommendation from the Politburo, and then delivered the line that would change history. He stated, "As far as I know, it takes effect immediately, without delay." This was a gross misstatement. The plan was for the new rules to be announced the next day, with a phased implementation. But in that moment of confusion, the signal was sent, and the shock was imminent. The effect was instantaneous and explosive. Within minutes, the news was being broadcast on West German television, with ARD's flagship nightly news program, Tagesschau, leading its 7 o'clock broadcast with the headline, "GDR opens border." East Germans, who had long watched Western TV despite the jamming efforts, saw the news and understood its meaning. A sense of disbelief quickly turned to a surge of adrenaline, and people began to move. They started walking, then jogging towards the border checkpoints that had symbolized their imprisonment for their entire lives, carrying nothing but hope and a profound sense of uncertainty. At the Bornholmer Strasse checkpoint, the first major crossing point, the scene quickly descended into controlled chaos. Thousands of East Berliners had gathered, demanding to be let through, but the bewildered border guards had received no new orders. Their superiors in the government were just as shocked by the announcement and were frantically trying to figure out what to do. The commander on the ground, Lieutenant Colonel Harold Jaeger, faced an impossible choice: open fire on the surging crowd and risk a massacre, or disobey his standing orders and open the gate. In a decision that demonstrated remarkable personal courage and pragmatism, Jaeger chose the latter, ordering his guards to step aside and let the people through. The dam had broken. The moment the first trickle of people crossed the checkpoint, the trickle became an unstoppable flood. Cars, trabbies, and people on foot poured through the open gates, greeted on the other side by bewildered but ecstatic West Berliners. People climbed onto the wall itself, dancing, singing, and spraying champagne, while others attacked the hated structure with hammers and chisels, earning the nickname Mauerspekte, or wallpeckers. Total strangers embraced, families torn apart for decades were reunited, and the sounds of celebration replaced the silence of the death strip. The shock of that night was visceral and emotional, a catharsis of nearly 30 years of separation, fear, and repression. In the days and weeks that followed, the dismantling of the Berlin Wall became a global spectacle, a symbol of the collapse of communist regimes across Eastern Europe. The Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, the peaceful ousting of the hardline government in Bulgaria, and the violent, shocking end of Nicolae Ceausescu's regime in Romania, all followed in quick succession. The geopolitical map of Europe, which had seemed so rigidly fixed for nearly half a century, was redrawn in a matter of months. The very existence of the Eastern Bloc, the Warsaw Pact, and the Soviet Union itself was now in question. A chain reaction triggered by one botched press conference. Theories and debates about the true nature of that night persist to this day, forming the mysterious undercurrent of this monumental event. Some historians argue that Schabowski's mistake was a deliberate, albeit clumsy, signal from reformers within the party to officially end the crisis. Others maintain it was a pure, unadulterated blunder, one of history's most fortunate accidents that averted a potentially violent crackdown. What is certain is that the popular will of the people, demonstrated in the streets of Leipzig and other cities, created the pressure that made such a breach both possible and ultimately inevitable. The fall of the wall remains a powerful shock, a testament to the fact that even the most formidable-looking structures can crumble when the human spirit demands freedom. The collapse of the Iron Curtain was not just a political event, it was a profound psychological shock for the entire world. For those who had lived under its shadow, the sudden access to freedom, consumer goods, and Western culture was disorienting and overwhelming. For the West, the sudden disappearance of its primary adversary created a new and uncertain global landscape, ending the bipolar order but introducing a new set of complex challenges regarding NATO expansion, European integration, and the economic disparities between East and West. The euphoria of 1989 gave way to the difficult and messy business of rebuilding nations and forging a new identity, a process that continues to shape our world today. The Berlin Wall today exists mostly in memory and in fragmented pieces scattered across the globe as monuments to a divided past. The shock of its fall reminds us that history is not always a slow, grinding process of change. It can also be sudden, unpredictable, and revolutionary. The night of November 9, 1989, demonstrated that the desire for human dignity and self-determination is a force more powerful than concrete walls and totalitarian states. It stands as one of the most positive and hopeful shocks in modern history, a moment when the world changed overnight. The end of the Cold War was not a victory for one side over another, but a liberation for millions, a closing of a dark chapter, and the shocking, uncertain dawn of a new era. The dawn of a new millennium, filled with the hope of a more interconnected and peaceful world, was abruptly shattered on a serene Sunday morning. December 26, 2004, began as a day of normalcy and holiday celebration for millions along the shores of the Indian Ocean. Beneath the seabed off the west coast of northern Sumatra, however, tectonic forces were reaching a catastrophic breaking point. No one on the surface could have perceived the immense energy building miles beneath their feet. The stage was set for one of the most deadly natural disasters in recorded human history. At 7:58 in the morning local time, the Indian Plate, which had been slowly subducting beneath the Burma Plate for centuries, finally ruptured. This was no ordinary earthquake. It was a megathrust event, releasing a colossal amount of stress accumulated over hundreds of years. Seismographs around the globe registered the initial quake, assigning it a staggering magnitude of between 9.1 and 9.3 on the Richter scale. The planet itself rang like a bell, with the seismic vibrations vibrating the entire Earth for days afterward. Scientists later calculated that the energy released was equivalent to the detonation of 23,000 Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs. The violent rupture caused a massive section of the seafloor, stretching over 1,200 kilometers, to lurch vertically by several meters. This sudden upward displacement of the Earth's crust acted like a giant piston, thrusting an immense volume of water upwards and outwards. A series of powerful waves, a tsunami, was born, silently racing across the deep ocean at speeds exceeding 800 kilometers per hour. In the open sea, these waves were often less than a meter high, a deceptive feature that made them virtually invisible to ships at sea. Their true destructive power was stored within their vast wavelength, which spanned hundreds of kilometers. The first landmass to feel the full force of nature's unleashed fury was the Indonesian province of Aceh, located just minutes from the epicenter. Within 15 to 20 minutes of the earthquake, walls of water, some reportedly reaching 30 meters in height, slammed into the coastal capital of Banda Aceh. The sheer kinetic energy of the wave obliterated everything in its path, sweeping away buildings, infrastructure, and tens of thousands of people in an instant. There was no time for a warning, no opportunity to run. The ocean had simply risen up and consumed the land. In a matter of minutes, a vibrant city was transformed into a landscape of rubble, water, and unimaginable horror. As the tsunami radiated outwards from Sumatra, its shockwave began a deadly journey across the entire Indian Ocean basin. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands in India were hit next, suffering widespread devastation and a significant loss of life. 2 hours after the initial earthquake, the wave struck the coast of Thailand, a popular tourist destination bustling with holidaymakers from around the world. The beaches of Phuket, Khao Lak, and Phi Phi Island were transformed from tropical paradises into scenes of chaos and destruction within seconds. The world was about to witness a tragedy of truly global proportions. In Thailand, the impact was a horrifying mixture of local devastation and international grief. Tourists, relaxing on the sand or snorkeling in the shallows, were suddenly caught in a torrent of churning water and debris. Many were swept away from their families, never to be seen again, while others clung to trees and buildings for survival. The resort town of Khao Lak was particularly hard hit,
with entire resorts razed to their foundations. The suddenness of the event left no time for comprehension, only for primal instinct and desperate acts of survival. The images of the devastation broadcast globally sent a shockwave of sympathy and horror across the planet. Simultaneously, the east coast of Sri Lanka, an island nation separated from India by the Palk Strait, was being battered by the waves. The tsunami struck with such force that it traveled several kilometers inland in some places, wiping out entire coastal towns and villages. Fishing communities, which depended entirely on the sea for their livelihood, were decimated, with their boats and homes smashed to pieces. In one of the single most tragic incidents of the disaster, a passenger train, the Quote 29, was overwhelmed by the waves near the town of Paralia, killing over 1,700 people. The scale of the loss in Sri Lanka was almost incomprehensible, with over 35,000 people confirmed dead. The eastern coast of India, particularly the state of Tamil Nadu, also suffered a catastrophic blow. The city of Chennai and the surrounding fishing villages were inundated, with the waves catching millions by surprise. The nuclear power plant at Kalpakkam, located on the coast, was temporarily shut down after seawater entered its pump station, raising fears of a secondary environmental disaster. Further down the coast, the Andaman Islands, a remote Indian territory closer to the epicenter, experienced immense destruction, with entire communities cut off from the world. The response in India was massive, but the scale of the tragedy stretched the nation's resources to their absolute limit. In the midst of this human tragedy, a strange and persistent phenomenon emerged, adding a layer of mystery to the disaster. Across the affected regions, there were numerous and credible reports of animals behaving erratically before the tsunami's arrival. In Sri Lanka's Yala National Park, a wildlife reserve hard hit by the waves, officials were astonished to find very few animal carcasses. It appeared that elephants, leopards, deer, and other creatures had sensed the impending danger and fled to higher ground well before humans perceived any threat. Scientists have proposed several theories, from an acute sensitivity to the infrasound generated by the earthquake to an ability to detect subtle changes in air pressure, but the phenomenon remains a subject of ongoing research and debate. Perhaps the most shocking aspect of the 2004 tsunami was that, in an age of advanced technology and global communication, such a vast loss of life was even possible. The Pacific Ocean was protected by a sophisticated multi-million-dollar tsunami warning system, but the Indian Ocean, historically a seismically quieter region, had virtually nothing. Governments in the region lacked the infrastructure, both technological and social, to detect an incoming tsunami and disseminate an effective warning to coastal communities. Tragically, vital time was lost as officials scrambled to understand the magnitude of the earthquake and its potential to generate a destructive wave. The absence of a simple siren system or a clear communication protocol meant that the most effective warning, the receding of the ocean just before the wave struck, was often misinterpreted as a curiosity rather than a sign to flee for higher ground. Hours after the initial impact, the tsunami's destructive energy reached the eastern coast of Africa, proving the truly global reach of the disaster. The countries of Somalia, Kenya, Tanzania, and even the far-off island nation of Madagascar experienced flooding and loss of life. In Somalia, located over 5,000 kilometers from the epicenter, the waves killed nearly 300 people and destroyed coastal villages, a shocking testament to the waves' persistence. The fishing communities, already vulnerable, saw their meager infrastructure and livelihoods washed away. This final, distant act of destruction cemented the 2004 tsunami as a planetary catastrophe, a sudden shock that resonated across 3 continents. The immediate aftermath was a scene of apocalyptic desolation, with a death toll that would eventually climb to over 230,000 people. Survivors faced a horrifying new reality. Surrounded by the wreckage of their homes, the bodies of the dead, and the constant threat of disease from contaminated water, the international community responded with an unprecedented outpouring of humanitarian aid, pledging billions of dollars in relief. Rescue teams, medical supplies, and food poured into the affected regions from around the world. This global response was a shock in itself, a powerful demonstration of human empathy and solidarity in the face of immense suffering. For the scientific community, the event provided a terrifying but invaluable opportunity to study the mechanics of megathrust earthquakes and their tsunamis. Researchers from around the world descended on the region, deploying GPS buoys and sonar to map the changes to the seafloor.
The data gathered revealed that the earthquake had caused the seabed to rise by as much as 10 meters in some places. Geophysicists also discovered that the immense force of the event had slightly altered the Earth's rotation, shortening the day by a fraction of a second. The 2004 tsunami fundamentally reshaped our understanding of geohazards and the planet's dynamic systems. One of the most significant and positive outcomes of the tragedy was the creation of the Indian Ocean Tsunami Warning and Mitigation System, IOTWMS. Learning the harsh lessons from the failure to warn the public, the United Nations spearheaded a collaborative effort to establish a network of buoys, seismographs, and communication protocols. By 2006, a rudimentary system was in place, and it has been continuously upgraded and refined ever since. This system, which now includes 25 countries, is designed to detect potentially tsunamigenic earthquakes and issue timely warnings to at-risk coastal communities. It stands as a direct, life-saving legacy of those who lost their lives. The long-term psychological and social shock of the tsunami continues to reverberate through the affected communities more than a decade later. Survivors, many of whom lost their entire families, live with profound trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. The process of identifying the dead was a monumental and heartbreaking task that took years, with many victims never formally identified. Orphanages were overwhelmed, and the socio-economic fabric of countless villages was torn apart. Rebuilding lives, not just homes, has been a slow, painful, and ongoing journey, demonstrating that the deepest wounds from such a shock are often invisible. In Aceh, Indonesia, the heart of the disaster, the rebuilding process was coupled with a surprising political transformation. The devastation created a window of opportunity that ended a nearly 30-year-long separatist conflict between the Free Aceh movement and the Indonesian government. A peace agreement was signed just 8 months after the tsunami, partly facilitated by the shared trauma and the immense international focus on the region. This unexpected turn of events, a peace born from catastrophe, is one of the most remarkable stories to emerge from the tragedy. It serves as a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, unforeseen positive change can sometimes take root. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami remains a profound global shock, a stark reminder of nature's immense and unpredictable power. It exposed the vulnerability of our modern world to ancient geological forces and highlighted the critical importance of scientific preparedness and international cooperation. The event reshaped coastlines, altered the planet itself, and forever changed the lives of millions of people. It was a horrifying, watershed moment that redefined our understanding of risk and responsibility on a planetary scale. The images of that day are seared into the collective memory of humanity, a permanent testament to a morning when the sea rose up and reminded the world of its fragile place within the natural order. Just over 15 years after the sea reminded the world of its fury, a far more insidious and invisible threat emerged from the heart of Asia, bringing modern civilization to a standstill in a way no natural disaster had done before. The year 2020 began with whispers of a mysterious illness in a distant city, a news story that seemed remote and contained to most of the globe's population. Yet, unlike the sudden, visible violence of a tidal wave, this was a silent, creeping shock that spread unseen along the arteries of globalization, carried in the breath of millions. It was a biological event that would test the limits of our scientific knowledge, our political systems, and our very sense of shared humanity. The shock was not just the virus itself, but the realization of how profoundly vulnerable our hyper-connected world truly was. In December of 2019, a cluster of unusual pneumonia cases was reported in the city of Wuhan, the capital of China's Hubei province, a major hub for industry and transportation.
Early investigations pointed to a novel coronavirus, a type of virus known to cause illness ranging from the common cold to severe respiratory syndromes like SARS and MERS. Leading virologists and epidemiologists immediately began a race against time to trace the virus's source, with many hypotheses centering on a zoonotic spillover from animals to humans at the Huanan seafood wholesale market. However, the theory of a laboratory origin from the nearby Wuhan Institute of Virology has persisted, creating a complex and politically charged debate that continues to this day. The exact origins, shrouded in a lack of transparency and early data, remain one of the most significant scientific and geopolitical mysteries of the 21st century. The true shock of this new pathogen, soon named SARS-CoV-2, was its extraordinary efficiency in leveraging the modern interconnected world to achieve a global reach in a matter of weeks. Within what felt like moments, cases began appearing far beyond China's borders, silently carried by air travelers to cities like Milan in Italy, Tehran in Iran, and Seattle in the United States. National governments, caught between protecting their economies and public health, often hesitated, downplaying the threat or reacting too slowly as the scale of the crisis became clear. This initial period of denial and inaction allowed the virus to gain a foothold, seeding community transmission that would prove nearly impossible to contain without drastic measures. By March of 2020, the World Health Organization officially declared a global pandemic, a term not used for a disease of this scale in over a century, signaling the start of a new and terrifying era. At the molecular level, scientists were unraveling a terrifyingly effective biological machine, perfectly adapted to exploit human biology. The virus was armed with a distinctive spike protein, which acted like a key, perfectly fitting into the ACE2 receptors found on the surface of human cells, particularly those lining the lungs and respiratory tract. This precise binding mechanism allowed the virus to hijack the cell's internal machinery, replicating itself with astonishing speed and triggering a powerful, often destructive immune response. In severe cases, this immune overreaction, known as a cytokine storm, led to widespread inflammation, pneumonia, acute respiratory distress syndrome, and multi-organ failure. Perhaps most alarmingly, the virus's ability to spread from asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic individuals made traditional symptomatic screening methods tragically ineffective, turning every person into a potential unseen vector. The world watched in disbelief as China took an unprecedented step in late January, placing the entire city of Wuhan, a metropolis of 11 million people, under a strict and total lockdown. Transportation links were severed, residents were ordered to stay in their homes, and a sprawling metropolis fell silent, a scene that felt more like a science fiction film than reality. Soon after, Italy became the epicenter of the pandemic in Europe, and its government took the shocking step of imposing a nationwide quarantine, locking down the entire country of 60 million people. The world watched as images emerged from Rome's usually bustling Via del Corso and Venice's empty canals, a haunting visual of a global civilization grinding to a halt. One by one, nations across the globe, from India to France to Brazil, implemented their own versions of lockdowns, stay-at-home orders, and border closures. The phrase, quote, entered the global lexicon as the shared mission became to slow the virus's spread to prevent healthcare systems from complete collapse. The economic shock of these lockdowns was instantaneous and catastrophic, triggering the worst global recession since the Great Depression nearly a century earlier. Entire industries, particularly hospitality, travel, and retail, were decimated overnight as consumer demand evaporated and governments mandated business closures. Stock markets around the world plunged, wiping out trillions of dollars in value in a matter of days, and supply chains, so finely tuned and optimized for efficiency, fractured under the strain. In the United States alone, more than 20 million jobs were lost in the month of April, a number so staggering it was difficult to comprehend. Governments responded with massive fiscal stimulus packages, injecting trillions of dollars into economies in an attempt to keep businesses afloat and support unemployed citizens. fundamentally reshaping the relationship between the state and the market in many countries. The human toll, however, was measured not in dollars but in lives lost and lives forever altered, as healthcare systems from the richest to the poorest nations were pushed to their absolute breaking point. In northern Italy's Lombardy region, hospitals were so overwhelmed that doctors were forced to make impossible triage decisions, choosing who would receive a ventilator and who would be left to die. In New York City, refrigerated trucks were parked outside hospitals to serve as makeshift morgues, a grim and iconic symbol of the pandemic's fury. Healthcare workers, celebrated as heroes, found themselves on the front lines of a brutal war, working endless shifts in horrifying conditions, often without adequate personal protective equipment. The psychological trauma of witnessing so much death and of patients dying alone, isolated from their families, left deep and lasting scars on a generation of medical professionals. In the face of this biological onslaught, the global scientific community mounted one of the most rapid and collaborative responses in human history, a shock of human ingenuity and determination. Within weeks of the virus's identification, its full genetic sequence was shared online by Chinese scientists, allowing researchers across the planet to immediately begin work on diagnostics, treatments, and vaccines. The development of effective vaccines at a speed previously thought impossible became the world's primary hope for a return to normalcy. This effort was supercharged by groundbreaking research into messenger RNA, or mRNA technology, which had been in development for decades but had never produced an approved vaccine for humans. Scientists at companies like Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna adapted this platform with breathtaking speed, designing a vaccine that teaches our cells to produce a harmless piece of the spike protein, thereby training the immune system to recognize and fight the real virus. The clinical trials for these new vaccines were conducted in record time, a process that would normally take years compressed into mere months without sacrificing scientific rigor or safety protocols. By the end of 2020, less than a year after the pandemic began, the first highly effective vaccines were being authorized for emergency use around the world, a monumental scientific achievement that would save millions of lives. The logistics of manufacturing and distributing billions of doses globally presented a whole new series of challenges, exposing deep inequalities between wealthy and poor nations. So-called vaccine nationalism took hold as countries raced to secure doses for their own populations, while many low-income countries faced the prospect of waiting years for widespread access. This global vaccine rollout, while a triumph of science, became a stark lesson in the politics and economics of global health inequity. Beyond the immediate health and economic crises, the pandemic unleashed a secondary shockwave of social and psychological disruption that has fundamentally altered society. The prolonged periods of isolation, fear, and uncertainty led to a dramatic global increase in mental health issues, including anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. The closure of schools for months or even years had a devastating impact on the education and development of children, exacerbating inequalities and creating a lost generation of learners whose academic progress has been severely stunted. The nature of work was transformed as millions of people shifted to remote work, a trend that is now reshaping urban centers, corporate culture, and the very concept of a workplace. The pandemic accelerated existing trends toward digitalization and e-commerce, while fundamentally changing how we socialize, travel, and interact with one another. Perhaps one of the most damaging and persistent shocks of the pandemic has been the infodemic, an overabundance of information, both accurate and false, that is spread as virally as the disease itself. Social media platforms became fertile ground for a torrent of misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories about the virus's origins, the efficacy of masks, and the safety of vaccines. This erosion of trust in scientific institutions, government, and mainstream media has had profound consequences, leading to vaccine hesitancy, public health threats, and deepened political polarization. The scientific method itself came under attack, as personal opinion and anecdotal evidence were often elevated to the same level as rigorous peer-reviewed research. This crisis of information and truth represents a societal wound that may prove even more difficult to heal than the biological one. Furthermore, the pandemic revealed a shocking new medical mystery, the phenomenon known as, quote, 34, or post-acute sequelae of SARS-CoV-2 infection, PASC. A significant percentage of people who recover from the initial infection continue to experience a wide range of debilitating symptoms for months or even years, including crushing fatigue, brain fog, shortness of breath, and heart palpitations. This condition does not discriminate and can affect people regardless of the severity of their initial illness, leaving previously healthy and active individuals unable to function. Research into long COVID is ongoing, but according to leading immunologists, it may be caused by a persistent viral reservoir, a dysregulated immune system, or autoimmune damage triggered by the initial infection. It stands as a shocking and sobering reminder that we have not yet fully understood the long-term consequences of this novel pathogen. The geopolitical landscape was also irrevocably reshaped by the pandemic, which acted as both an accelerator and an amplifier of existing international tensions. Nationalism surged as countries closed their borders and competed for scarce medical resources, straining alliances and international cooperation. The relationship between the United States and China deteriorated to a new low, marked by mutual recrimination over the virus's origins and the World Health Organization's response. Global institutions designed to handle such crises were revealed to be slow, bureaucratic, and often politically paralyzed. The pandemic exposed the fragility of the liberal international order and raised profound questions about global governance, preparedness, and the world's ability to collectively manage existential threats. In the end, the COVID-19 pandemic was a multifaceted global shock that stopped the planet not with a bang, but with a whisper, a microscopic particle that brought the world to its knees. It was a biological crisis that exposed the deep inequalities in our societies, a scientific challenge that was met with astonishing innovation, and a social disruption that reshaped our daily lives in ways we are still processing. The pandemic tested our resilience, our compassion, and our trust in one another and in our institutions. It was a brutal reminder that in our modern globalized age, a threat to one corner of the world is a threat to all, and our greatest challenges can only be overcome through unprecedented global cooperation and a shared commitment to truth and science. The scars left by 2020 will be permanent, a testament to a time when the entire world held its breath together, waiting for a new dawn to break after the longest, darkest night. But as humanity began to process the profound biological shock of a pandemic, another one was gathering momentum, not in the wet markets of Wuhan, but in the sterile research labs of Silicon Valley and the vast humming data centers of Northern Virginia. This new shock was not biological, but cognitive, a silent, invisible revolution of intelligence itself that would erupt into public consciousness with startling speed. For decades, artificial intelligence had been a promise of the future, a staple of science fiction, a background feature in our phones and recommendation engines, something that was perpetually 10 years away. Then, in November of 2022, everything changed when a small company called OpenAI released a free online tool called ChatGPT to the public. Within 2 months, it had reached 100 million active users, the fastest-growing consumer application in history. And the world was suddenly grappling with a technology that could write poetry, debug code, compose music, and pass graduate-level exams. According to leading computer scientists, the public release of ChatGPT represented a Sputnik moment for artificial intelligence, a stark demonstration that the field had leaped far beyond public and even expert expectations. The underlying technology, known as a large language model, or LLM, was not entirely new, but its scale and capabilities were a profound shock, built on an architecture called the Transformer, first pioneered by researchers at Google. Modern research reveals these models are trained by ingesting colossal amounts of text and data from the internet, essentially learning the statistical patterns of human language, knowledge, and reasoning. This process requires immense computational power, consuming vast amounts of electricity and relying on specialized graphics processing units, or GPUs, designed primarily for video gaming, creating a new geopolitical dependency on the semiconductor industry. The result is a system that does not understand in a human sense, but can generate human-like text with a fluency and coherence that is genuinely unnerving, raising immediate questions about the nature of consciousness and intelligence itself. The economic shockwave from this rapid advancement is already beginning to ripple across the global economy, promising unprecedented productivity while simultaneously threatening mass disruption to the labor market. Unlike previous technological revolutions that primarily automated physical labor, this one targets cognitive tasks, challenging the security of white-collar professions once considered immune, from paralegals and journalists to software developers and financial analysts. A report from Goldman Sachs estimated that generative AI could automate the equivalent of 300 million full-time jobs, potentially reshaping entire industries and redefining the very concept of work for billions of people. While new roles like prompt engineer and AI ethicist are emerging, there is a widespread fear that the transition will be too rapid for societies to adapt, potentially leading to massive unemployment and increased wealth inequality. This economic shock forces a fundamental reevaluation of education systems, social safety nets, and our societal definition of a valuable human contribution. Beyond the economy, the rise of AI unleashes a torrent of societal and ethical dilemmas that pose an existential challenge to the information ecosystems that underpin modern democracy. The same technology that can draft a sonnet can also generate infinitely scalable misinformation, creating persuasive fake news articles, emails, and social media posts that are nearly indistinguishable from reality. This infodemic on steroids threatens to further erode public trust and political stability, making the COVID-era information crisis seem like a minor prelude. Furthermore, AI models trained on the vast, biased archives of the Internet inevitably learn and perpetuate human prejudices, raising serious concerns about algorithmic discrimination in critical areas like hiring, loan applications, and even criminal justice. According to AI ethics researchers, the black box nature of these neural networks, where even their creators cannot fully explain their reasoning, makes accountability and fairness incredibly difficult to enforce. Perhaps the most profound and disturbing shock lies in the long-term implications of creating an intelligence that may one day surpass our own, a concept known as artificial general intelligence, or AGI. This is no longer the exclusive domain of science fiction authors. Many of the pioneers of AI, including Geoffrey Hinton, often called the godfather of AI, have expressed grave concerns about the technology they helped create. Hinton left his position at Google in 2023 specifically to speak freely about the existential risks he fears, warning that we are rapidly building systems more intelligent than ourselves without understanding how to control them. The core fear is a misalignment problem. How can we ensure that an entity vastly more intelligent than humanity shares our values and goals when we cannot even agree on those values ourselves? Prominent figures like Elon Musk and thousands of scientists have signed open letters calling for a global pause on the development of the most powerful AI systems, warning that we are racing towards a potential catastrophe without adequate safety research or international oversight. This technological race is rapidly becoming the new defining geopolitical competition, a 21st-century arms race fought not with nuclear warheads, but with lines of code and processing power. The United States and China are the two clear superpowers in this new arena, pouring billions of dollars into AI research and development, recognizing its strategic importance for economic dominance, military superiority, and cultural influence. The Pentagon is actively developing AI for autonomous weapons systems and intelligence analysis, while Beijing is integrating AI into its surveillance state and industrial complex, creating a chilling new model of digital authoritarianism. Unlike nuclear technology, which was governed by treaties and international bodies like the International Atomic Energy Agency, there is currently no global framework to regulate the development of superintelligent AI. This dangerous vacuum raises the prospect of a race to the bottom, where nationalistic competition pressures nations to cut corners on safety and ethics to gain a strategic advantage, potentially dooming us all in the process. In response to these escalating shocks, a new and vital field of research is emerging, known as AI safety and alignment, which focuses on the monumental task of making AI systems safe, controllable, and beneficial to humanity.
Organizations like Anthropic are pioneering research into constitutional AI, a method for training models to adhere to a set of explicit principles, effectively teaching them a moral framework to govern their outputs. Governments are also beginning to react, with the European Union passing its landmark AI Act, a comprehensive attempt to regulate the technology based on its level of risk, and the White House issuing executive orders to guide the development of safe and secure AI. However, according to policy experts, these regulatory efforts are struggling to keep pace with the breakneck speed of innovation, which continues to accelerate month by month. The central challenge remains: how do you govern a technology that is fundamentally designed to learn and evolve in ways we cannot predict? Ultimately, the rapid rise of artificial intelligence is shaping up to be the most complex and consequential shock in human history. A force that holds the simultaneous promise of solving our greatest problems and creating our gravest perils. It could help us cure diseases, reverse climate change, and explore the cosmos, unlocking a new era of human flourishing and creativity. Alternatively, it could destabilize nations, dismantle economies, and lead to a future where humanity is no longer the dominant intelligence on the planet. This technology is a mirror, reflecting the entirety of human knowledge, our brilliance, our biases, our art, and our darkest impulses back at us. We are the architects of this next shock, and as we stand at this pivotal juncture in history, the choices we make in the next few years will determine the trajectory of life on Earth for millennia to come, forcing us to finally confront what it truly means to be human in an age of thinking machines.